Okay, so by the end of the lesson today, you should be able to give me the definitions of the basic crime scene vocab that we're going to be talking about and describe the three main kinds of evidence that's used in forensics. So first off, you've got a crime scene. This is where the crime happens. And you have two different kinds. You have primary, which is where the original crime actually happened. And then you have a secondary, which is related to the primary. So for example, if someone were killed in their house, that would be the primary crime scene, and then their body is moved in a car, that would be secondary crime scene. So it may be that you find the body at the secondary crime scene and have to backtrack to find where they were actually killed at. So suspect is the person you think committed the crime. The accomplice is the person who helped. The alibi is pretty much the statement of where they were at the time of the crime. Now, if you've watched any crime shows, you probably have a pretty good idea of suspect, accomplice, and alibi. The accomplice can be anyone who knowingly or unknowingly helped with the crime. Accomplice does not necessarily mean that they knew they were helping. They could have loaned someone their car, and then the suspect moved the body in the car. That would still make them an accomplice, but not necessarily a knowing one. So depending on whether they knew they were helping or not, they could or could not get into trouble for that. So types of evidence, we're talking about testimonial evidence, physical evidence, and trace evidence. So the first one, testimonial, is statements of witnesses or neighbors, some sort of written or oral testimony of what they saw. Physical evidence is material items that are present at a crime scene for secondary or primary. Basically, anything you can collect is physical evidence. If that physical evidence is in a tiny, itty-bitty little amount, that's called trace evidence. So you've got testimonial, physical, and trace. Those are the three big categories. Under physical, you have a bunch of different kinds of physical evidence. And the different kinds of evidence also become different things in court. So there might be trace evidence that happens to be a blood drop that would actually be identity evidence in court, kind of thing, because it gives you identity. So these are the three main kind, but we're going to break them down further as we go on later. So um, what evidence of the crime scene can give you? So first off, evidence can prove that a crime was actually committed as opposed to it being an accident. It can establish key elements of the crime, like when it happened, where it happened, who was there. It can link a suspect with a crime scene or with a victim. So that's important. If the evidence can make that connection between two people, that will oftentimes be really helpful for the investigators. Establishing identity of either the victim or the suspect. Corroborate verbal evidence testimony, meaning the witness says he was carrying a coffee cup, and then you find the spilled coffee cup at the scene. That would corroborate the witness testimony. Exonerate the innocent means that it proves they didn't do it or that they were not there. And it also gives detectives leads to work the case and gives them ideas of where to go next for the next piece of information. Now, as far as people at a crime scene, first people on the crime scene are almost always police officers. They're usually the first to arrive. They secure the crime scene and keep people from walking through it. If they think somebody's involved, they can detain them and hold on to them until they can interview them or take their fingerprints or arrest them or whatever. Then you'll get a CSI unit. So that would be a crime scene investigation unit. They document all of the details of the crime scene. They collect physical evidence. They don't usually interview witnesses. Usually that's done by the police officers. Sometimes, if it's obvious it's a crime, you might get a district attorney who is there because they may have to apply for search warrants. They can speak to anything that's legal, like whether you're legally allowed to search that shop on the back of the property or not. So it's kind of, district attorneys may be there or may just be there by phone. If it's a homicide, you're going to have a medical examiner, sometimes a coroner. Coroners basically just file paperwork. They pronounce somebody, yep, officially dead, and stamp the paperwork. Whereas the medical examiner is the one who's going to actually perform an autopsy. They will sometimes be able to determine cause of death at the scene, but almost always they wait until after the autopsy. You're going to have specialist forensic experts like forensic entomologists, which study bugs and insects that are at the crime scene, anthropologists to study maybe bones because all you have is a skeleton. Um, you may call in someone who's an expert in blood spatter analysis or something like that, depending on what you need. There are people who specialize in lots of different kinds of evidence collection. You're also definitely going to have detectives who interview witnesses. They consult with the CSI unit. They take the information from the CSI unit, and that leads them to interview people who may not have been there at the time, but may be able to give some information about why the person was killed, kind of thing. So you have different kinds of evidence. You've got drug chemistry, which basically they determine presence of controlled substances or poisons at the crime scene. Trace chemistry, which basically anything that is super, super small, you're going to find in quote unquote trace amounts. So fire investigators, explosive experts, people who look at paints and gases that were at the scene of the crime would be trace chemistry investigators. You also have microscopy, which basically just means using a microscope to look at different kinds of evidence. Biology and DNA, they're looking at body fluids, trying to determine identity of suspects, identity of victims, that sort of thing. Toxicology is almost entirely looking for poisons or drugs, either in a person's bloodstream or in something they ate, along those lines. You've also got latent prints. Latent fingerprints are hidden. So as you can see in this picture up here at the top, they're lifting fingerprints from a doorway. Those would be latent prints or hidden prints. You've also got ballistics experts. They're looking at cartridge casings like this one here, or the lands and grooves, the markings on a bullet, or even tool marks, which would be looking at like a screwdriver. Was this the screwdriver that pried open this door? Kind of thing. And so they would be able to tell that from marks left. Question documents, compare things like handwriting, ink, paper, to see if there was a forgery somehow involved. So this is an example of a forged check. You can see that the darker ink, it was one kind of pen, and then they wrote with a different kind of pen, changed the names and the dollar amounts and the signature at the bottom. And so that's a way they can forge checks to kind of con people out of money, essentially. But you would only see those differences under specific kinds of light and so on, that you could actually see question documents. So that ends us with the basic investigation of evidence. And so you can go back through here and take a look at who would be at the crime scene, different kinds of evidence you would find at the crime scene, and the three main kinds of evidence that we've been talking about. So hopefully that helps. Good luck.